And they talked about the dirty, no-good people who filled those bootleg bars to overflowing every weekend. The police rarely entered Sunset during that period unless there was a killer. And even then it was just to pick up the body. These crimes were never investigated. No one was ever charged. It was always self-defense. In other words, policing was almost non-existent on the other side of the tracks. You can't imagine how far things have changed. White folks looked down their noses at their black and brown field hands, but the local economy couldn't possibly have survived without field labor. There were never enough workers. The owner of a grain elevator once told his black workers, "If you can keep yourself out of the graveyard, I'll keep you out of the jail." Then everything changed. Commodity prices for wheat and cotton started dropping. Irrigation water was all pumped dry, pretty much. Interest rates were sky high, and only the farmers rich enough to buy the big combines and tractors and cotton pickers were able to survive. Larry Stewart gave it his best shot, trying to keep the family farm going, but by the late 1980s, he needed a city job to supplement his income and pay the bills. But fortunately, the Tulia economic storm cloud had a little silver lining. The criminal justice industry was exploding. The local police and sheriff's departments were hiring, buying sleek new cars. Larry signed off with the sheriff's department, first as a reserve officer working for free, and then as a deputy. And in 1991, he ran for sheriff and won. Meanwhile, a private prison was going up west of town. A group of sleazy developers from Houston, fronted by former Texas Governor Mark White, had conned 6 desperate towns in West Texas into buying or building prisons they didn't need. And for 6 years, these prisons sat empty. But as they say, if we build it, it will come. Ann Richards, the liberal governor of Texas, decided to enhance her tough-on-crime credentials by starting a prison building scheme. But then she got into an election race in 1994 with George W. Bush. That changed things a little bit because the mass incarceration Ferrari really went into overdrive when he took over as governor. And shortly after Larry Stewart became sheriff in 1991, the war on drugs came to Swisher County for the first time. A 26-county narcotics task force was organized in Amarillo, and soon Larry and his deputies were running practice drug busts out in the country on isolated abandoned farmhouses, just itching for their chance to do the real thing. According to rumor, there was a lot of work that needed to be done. In 1998, Sheriff Stewart learned that if he hired an undercover officer, he could clean up his town for free. Federal burn grant program would take care of the officer and ancillary costs, and the task force in Amarillo would provide training and oversight. He didn't have to lift a finger, didn't have to spend a dime, and he'd clean up his town for sure. Most of the black men who once picked cotton in Swisher County were now bouncing from one minimum job to another with extended periods of unemployment in between. According to rumor, most of these men were living with their mamas or shacking up with a girlfriend who had a welfare check. There was a lot of suspicious activity going on, reports had. Police couldn't prove it, but it appeared that the crack epidemic by 1995 had finally made its way to little Swisher County. A skinny young man named Tom Coleman answered an ad in the newspaper. They gave him a fake ID, fake driver's license, fake probation papers, and a fake name, T.J. Dawson. 18 months later, the operation was over. It got off to kind of a slow start. During phone calls with Larry Stewart, Coleman would complain that no black folks seemed to want to sell him drugs. They didn't trust him for some reason. And then things got even worse because Coleman got indicted on theft charges by the sheriff he had worked for in nearby Cochran County, and Larry had a problem. He knew that if he called up the sheriff of Cochran County, he was going to learn some things about his undercover man he didn't want to know, so he didn't make the call.